Merhaba, I'm Susanne Böhler. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak about cities, their challenges in urban mobility and proven processes for a transition path to sustainability and carbon neutrality. Let's start. Cities are the powerhouse of the modern economy and home to millions of people. 70% of the EU population lives in cities today, and this is projected to reach almost 84% in 2050. Accompanied with that is that cities' inhabitants are increasingly facing challenges such as congestion, poor air quality and excessive noise. In addition, 23% of the EU's transport greenhouse gas emissions come from urban areas. Globally, urban areas consume over 65% of the world's energy, accounting for more than 70% of CO2 emissions. It is therefore crucial that cities act as incubators, experimentation and innovation ecosystems to initiate the change and to help other cities and regions in their transition. Addressing these challenges in cities, the new Urban Mobility Framework Initiative from 2021 proposes measures to encourage EU countries to develop urban transport systems that are safe, accessible, inclusive, affordable, smart, resilient and emission-free. All sectors should be climate neutral, net zero by 2050. Including surface and air transport, and this is particularly challenging. The selection and support of 100 European cities, under which Izmir and Istanbul are, to become climate neutral by 2030 is the milestone. And sustainable urban mobility is key to achieve climate neutrality. But what are the projected costs, efforts and benefits of the urban mobility transition? The EIT Urban Mobility estimates that European cities of more than 50,000 inhabitants will need extra investments in sustainable mobility measures compared to the business-as-usual scenario of €86 billion by 2030. The analysis also shows that meeting the 2030 target requires an ambitious reduction of private motorized transport in urban areas from an average of 44% modal share in 2019 to 20% in 2030. The sustainable urban mobility transition in European cities could lead to net benefits of up to €177 billion by 2030. Of these net benefits, saved costs from reduced CO2 emissions, pollution, noise and fatalities amount to €79 billion in 2030. This means that on average, each euro invested in the transition can generate up to €3.06 by 2030. But how to tackle, start and enforce the urban mobility transition process? The recent EU framework presents a reinforced approach to sustainable urban mobility plans, SUMP. Introduced in 2013, sustainable urban mobility plans are a cornerstone of EU urban mobility. SUMPs help to address mobility challenges for the entire functional urban area, including synergies with spatial, energy and climate plans. The current analysis of the status of the SUMP also shows that there are shortcomings. There is uneven implementation of SUMPs between and within member states. Many towns and cities still do not have an SUMP. Those with an SUMP, there are large variations in their quality. Moreover, more effort are needed to ensure that sustainable urban logistic planning is better embedded in SUMP. But what is the aim of SUMP and why has it become a point of global reference? SUMP aims at a sustainable city. Each city, being big or small, can start an SUMP, following a standard planning process which needs to be adapted to geographical context and specificity. Being ambitious, to do better as business as usual, and to develop investment plans for comprehensive mobility projects are the starting point. The results are unique for each city. On average, it takes 2 years to develop the mobility and action plan. But the process is continuous because it requires monitoring of the progress and taking countermeasures if the measures are not on track. Why is SUMP the appropriate concept to start the transition process in urban mobility? Transport is much more than just infrastructure, modes and the management of the traffic. Transport is also a social and political system consisting of different kinds of stakeholders which have a certain interest in mobility. SUMP combines technical transport planning with a social and political process. The best would be that all citizens and groups in a city would have the same sense of urgency for a change and would follow the same goals. But this is not the reality. Decision makers, people and businesses have different and changing interests and demands, and this plays a major role in mobility planning. Often, planners know quite well what the mobility problems are, what projects are needed to solve problems, but there are a lot of barriers. There are solutions which are not feasible, not very well accepted by decision makers or the public. Often solutions are scattered, only a few benefit from and do not fit to each other. SUMP could help by providing a framework for goal-oriented decision-making and to find good compromises in a very complex environment. Almost 1,000 cities in Europe have already started SUMP and have developed comprehensive multimodal transport plans similar to SUMPs. And more are coming. In the next few years, several Turkish cities will develop an SUMP and will become part of the large European SUMP community. According to EU policy, by 2025, all bigger cities in Europe should have an SUMP. National governments should help cities to manage these challenging processes. The Commission asked each member state to put in place a national long-term SUMP support program with a national manager. This national program could contain legal, financial and organizational measures to help build capacity and implement SUMPs in compliance with European SUMP guidelines. What are the urban mobility challenges and what is the reality in many cities nowadays SUMP needs to tackle? Still, private motorized transport is very important for the functionality of our cities. In many places, cars allow population to gain access to the city, and in cities with low public transport infrastructure, car traffic allows access to other parts of the city. It increases economic opportunities as well as the safety of commuters. We also should not underestimate the status symbols of expensive and big cars. But we all know the number of cars causes a big problem for the environment, for our safety and the overall quality of life in our cities. Therefore, many cities, SUMPs, try to find a better balance between the different modes of transport. For the transformation to more livable cities and a carbon-zero future, we need both. The mobility transition, which is the shift to biking, walking and public transport, and an energy transition with cleaner vehicles, for example electric vehicles. But electric vehicles are not really an option if power is produced with fossil energy. Public transport already plays an important role in our cities, also in Turkish cities, with trams, metro, buses and on-demand services. In 2018, 50 billion passengers were carried by buses, trams and metros in EU cities, which means that 100 million car trips every day are saved. Local public transport services also contribute to the EU economy with 130 to 150 billion euro per year. But in the last years, the use of public transport in European cities has only slightly increased, and the COVID-19 pandemic strongly hit public transport operations and ridership. So cities need to take stronger action to shift from the current approach based on traffic flows to an approach based on moving people and goods more sustainably. This means a stronger collective public transport backbone. Public transport planning should also address connections with the areas outside the city center, including connections to the suburbs and rural areas beyond the city. Therefore, increased and accelerated action and new investments with a particular focus on public transport, multimodality and active mobility infrastructure is needed. Also, cycling and walking have increased in many cities. Especially during the pandemic, in many cities the number of cyclists increased tremendously. But the downside of this is that 38% of road fatalities in the EU occur in urban areas, and 70% of deaths are vulnerable road users, such as pedestrians and cyclists. In future, mobility system, vulnerable road users need to receive more attention, particularly if road fatalities and injuries should be reduced to almost zero. Safe sidewalks and cycling paths are an important precondition to receiving this target. All road users, including motorized, need to adapt to this new landscape through increased awareness and education for road safety. So what are we finding is a very diverse picture in many cities. On one hand, car traffic still dominates mobility and urban space. And on the other hand, there are many different initiatives and projects for more sustainable modes. So the good thing is cities and also the Turkish cities and communities are already on the transition path and have changed a lot by introducing new pedestrianized zones, cycling lanes, micro-mobility service and new parking arrangements. But we need more speed, acceleration to do better and more systematic approaches instead of isolated ones. The novelty of SUMP is that it emphasizes the need for systemic and integrated planning and thinking, because no single measure of cycling, walking, public transport or parking on its own will be sufficient to achieve a livable city and carbon neutrality. It is important to think and act based on a combination of measures which complement each other. Therefore, it is a particular step in the planning process to combine the different types of infrastructure, financial, technological, regulatory, behavioral as well as soft measures in a smart way. A good example of such a package is the combination of a cycling expansion infrastructure program with an enforced parking regulation in public spaces. Another example is the combination of different restrictions on private vehicles combined with reallocation of road space to active modes, like the concept of superblocks. Several cities have already proven that complex interventions backed up by an SUMP could have a huge impact. Sometimes these interventions start with a pilot in a neighborhood, which are upscaled after successful evaluation. Good analysis and a systematic approach by all actors, planners and politicians are necessary to achieve this, but the effort is worth it. This integrated and systematic approach requires strong cooperation among the stakeholders and all available competencies in a city. SUMP is a city-led innovation process. The mobility-relevant administrative departments in a city should be in regular contact with each other to coordinate the planning tasks, to exchange data, agree on strategies and organize funding. The establishment of close cooperation mechanism is key. Private actors and interest groups outside the city administration need to be consulted as well. Decision makers in politics, for example, the chairpersons of technical committees and the members of the city boards need to be reported to. Of course, capacities and resources must be available for this networking. It is accepted that a considerable financial and organizational investment is associated with this. Planners, experts, and politicians are not acting independently in an SUMP. Participation should prepare and secure social and political support for change processes. In addition, the knowledge and everyday know-how, data, competencies, and financial capacities of other actors and also of the general public are needed for decision-making. Without participation, there is a risk that only an inadequate picture of reality and existing solutions will be obtained, and that important structural changes will fail due to the blocking of actors. And yes, participation can delay processes and create barriers prematurely, thus narrowing the scope for action. But there is no alternative to participation. It depends on how well it is done. In addition to the cooperation of stakeholders and being in a dialogue with the public, integration means even more. Firstly, we need to take a look at the comprehensive network, not only at the city level, but on the whole functional urban area. Secondly, we need to consider the interrelation of the mobility system with urban development and land use, because walking and cycling and an efficient public transport service require a dense urban layout. Thirdly, we need to include all modes in planning and related sectoral planning processes. So cities need to adapt this process to their local circumstances while following and respecting existing guidelines and instructions from higher political level. Each city needs to articulate an explicit and local specific societal vision of what the future city should look like, which could be translated into general and specific mobility objectives and strategies. Because, as the philosopher Seneca already noted, if you don't know the harbor you want to sail to, no wind is the right one. The vision might look into the long-term goals till 2050 and shorter terms ones, for example, within the time horizon covered by the SUMP measure implementation. Beyond a specific project or plan, the mobility change must be thought of in phases over a longer period of time, even decades, and more than just one SUMP. In the center of these phases is the implementation of different measures, pilots and real experiments, and thus the process of change in mobility. In this respect, phases of more intensive planning and cooperation between decision makers and stakeholders alternate with implementation and monitoring of varying intensity. This is not at all a mechanistic process. In reality, there are many uncertainties and unpredictable situations that planners have to react to. The task is to approach situations and opportunities flexibly and to learn constantly in this SUMP process. What we will have achieved through these complex processes and decisions and the use of not unconsiderable resources of time and money. We will have a much more complete understanding of what combined actions are needed and where, to hand over a better mobility system, aiming at social inclusion and human well-being to our children, grandchildren and loved ones. Thank you very much for your attention.